So our next segment, we're going to talk about how the collections held in various institutions can help revive Indigenous languages today. And we've got 3 presentations which will run for about 15 minutes each. Just working backwards from lunch, we're going to take lunch at 12:30, so we hope to finish around 10-15 minutes before that, where we can ask some of our panellists some questions. So we've got 3 presentations going for 15 minutes each. Our first presentation this morning is Dr. Susan Hellman and Holly Gill. Dr. Susan Hellman has worked as a curator since 2004. She co-curated Cook in the Pacific with Dr. Martin Woods, and she's worked on previous library exhibitions. Joining her is Holly Gill, who's a Gungari woman from southwest Queensland and one of the National Library's 2017 Indigenous graduates. She was also assistant curator on Cook in the Pacific. Please welcome Susan and Holly.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Our exhibition, Cook in the Pacific, which closes tomorrow, explores Cook's Pacific voyages as meetings of peoples and their knowledge systems, of places experienced, cultures shared and exchanges made. We kept returning to the idea of voice. There are voices in the journals and embodied in the objects. There are voices in the portraits and landscapes. All of these objects have people behind them with lived experience and cultural backgrounds, from the writers of journals to the makers of cultural objects. Then there is the ongoing resonance the objects have to First Nations communities today. And this is a screenshot of a page on our website with some of the statements communities shared with us. There are voices also in the apparent silences. As you enter the exhibition, you hear voices immediately, with welcomes to country and then with greetings from some of the First Nations peoples we consulted for the exhibition. And the voices spill through the exhibition. It's not an understatement to say that the 3 voyages Cook led to the Pacific between 1768 and his death in 1779 are amongst the best documented voyages of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. We selected numerous journals made on the voyages and came to recognise the voices of the people who wrote them. For example, for the Endeavour voyage, Cook's language is thorough but circumspect. Banks is more effusive. Pickersgill's journal is spare and direct. We see people of the Pacific through their eyes. We can read Pacific languages they heard through their ears. First Nations peoples we spoke to told us these journal accounts are of value to them as they document, though through European eyes, their ancestors and their place. We became fascinated by the records of Pacific languages we kept seeing in the Cook Voyage journals, both published and manuscript. You can't help but notice them. In manuscript form, they are visually exciting, something we're always looking for in a manuscript, and usually legible. There are frequent comments in the journals comparing the Pacific languages they had heard. It's often said that men on Cook's voyages became proficient in the language of the Society Islands after numerous voyages to the Pacific, including before Cook. Communication then, as now, was important. They needed to be able to trade for fresh food. First Nations people of the Pacific who sailed with Cook, such as Tupaia, Maya and Tiaroa, and others could act as interpreters and intermediaries. Of course, these records of language are not always accurate, but without doubt they are extraordinary legacies of many meetings that took place between Cook and the men who sailed with him and the people of the Pacific they met. In these records of language, we could be transported from here to then, when people came together, trying to understand each other and make themselves understood. That people on both sides of the conversation could do this all over the Pacific says something fundamental about human curiosity and non-verbal communication, especially how they got to the point at which it was clear that they were naming things. Our paper today is in two parts. Mine is the overview of language records featured in our Cook in the Pacific exhibition, and Holly will talk about working with First Nations communities on bringing these to life. At the core of the exhibition are 4 major voyage manuscripts, these that you see on the screen. They are around a compass-like structure, the one with the globe in it, tracing Cook's 3 Pacific voyages. 3 of the 4 manuscripts contain records of Pacific languages. First is a word list, a Gugu Yimithir, recorded at Endeavour River, Cooktown in 1770. It appears in Joseph Banks's Endeavour Journal, which we've borrowed from the State Library of New South Wales. Banks, the 27-year-old wealthy naturalist, prefaces this word list by saying, "Of their language I can say very little. Our acquaintance with them was of so short a duration that none of us attempted to use a single word of it to them. Consequently, the list of words I have given could be got no other manner than by signs inquiring of them what in their language signified such a thing, a method obnoxious to many mistakes. For instance, a man holds in his hand a stone and asks the name of it. Myself and 2 or 3 more got from them as many words as we could, and having noted down those which we thought from circumstances we were not mistaken in, we compared our lists. Those in which all the lists agreed, or rather were contradicted by none, we thought ourselves morally certain not to be mistaken in. Of these, my list chiefly consists. It includes the word Bama, a man or human being in Gugu Yimithir, but omits kangaroo, which is in Parkinson's list. We've had to page turn Banks's journal for preservation reasons in the exhibition, but it's now open to another important moment from the 48 days the men of the Endeavour spent up at Cooktown, what the Gugu Yimithir regard as the first reconciliation between Aboriginal people and Europeans. Then we have Surgeon David Samuel's journal, open to war songs and a lamentation from New Zealand, dating from February 1777. These are considered the most substantial written records of Maori language to that time. Samuel tells us how he came to record them. They frequently show us their war hiva on board the ship, which is admirably calculated to strike terror into their enemies, consisting in violent gestures and contortion of their faces and bodies, hanging out their tongues, staring as if their eyes were ready to start out of their heads, and repeating in a vehement tone and manner a song, probably breathing contempt and defiance of their foes. These war songs they call ehaga, several of which Tearoa used to repeat to us. The words are as follows, but we are quite at a loss for the meaning of them. So he is saying, the verses you see in the exhibition were actually told him by Tearoa. Now Tearoa, or Te Wehera, was the son of a chief. He joined Cook's 3rd voyage at Queen Charlotte Sound, or Totaranui, Aotearoa, New Zealand, in February 1777. Totaranui was one of Cook's favourite harbours, and his ships went there 5 times over the 3 voyages. Tearoa left the voyage just over 8 months later at Huahine in the Society Islands with Mai. Cook describes him as an exceedingly well-disposed young man with strong natural parts. When William Bligh of Bounty fame visited in 1789, he was told that Tearoa had died within a few years. To the 3rd list, the Cook Journal's editor par excellence, J.C. Beaglehole, states confidently that the Nootka Sound word list, it was collected up in Vancouver Island in North America. It appears in Cook's 3rd voyage journal in April 1778. Beaglehole thought that it must have been collected by William Anderson, the young surgeon on the Resolution, also a careful documenter of language. The Nootka Sound word list is quite long at 13 pages, and you can see all of them in the touchscreens we have in the exhibition. Yet Cook says in the paragraphs immediately preceding the word list, "We had learnt little more of their language than to ask the names of things and the 2 simple words yes or no. The following list contains most of the words we got of their language. It will be a sufficient specimen and may in some measure enable us to find out which of the neighbouring nations these people bear the most affinity to. The Nootka word list is arranged alphabetically. Then there are names of different parts of the body and numbers. To round out our 4 voices, we have Cook's letterbook copy of his secret instructions for the Endeavour voyage. So through them, we have the voices of the Lords of the Admiralty as well. We used these 4 manuscripts for the touchscreens you'll see in the exhibition and explored other records of language. Parkinson's Tahitian and Endeavour River word lists and Samwell's Tongan word list. We discussed these lists with First Nations communities and they generously recorded words and shared their insights. It's truly been an enormous privilege. For more on this rich journey, please welcome Holly.
Thank you, Susanna. Hello, everyone. Yawala, hello. My name is Holly. I'm a Gungari woman from the southwest region of Queensland, and you'll hear from another Gungari woman, Arnie Lynette Nixon, and Elder this afternoon. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to ancestors and elders past, present, and future. I extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander peoples here today, or any other First Nations peoples, and I include those watching from home. Hello. When working with any materials relating to or created by Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander peoples or any First Nations peoples, it is considered best practice to involve, collaborate, and consult with the community that the material belongs to, relates to, was made by, or used by. Given the amount of cultural objects we have in the exhibition, along with historical documents that describe meetings of people, cultural practices and customs, and language records, it was paramount for us to consult and collaborate with First Nations peoples to include their stories and their perspectives as part of this exhibition. As part of the development of Cook and the Pacific, we spoke with a number of First Nations communities on the east coast of Australia and across the Pacific about their place, their culture, their story, and these word lists. Some of these communities included the Guugu Yimithirr peoples at Wallumbulbiri, Endeavour River, the Moa-Chat Mutschalat peoples at Vancouver Island in North America, the Cultural Office of French Polynesia in Tahiti, the local Canberra Tongan community, the Murrumarang peoples at Ulladulla Local Aboriginal Land Council on the south coast, and more. Community members and elders shared their perspectives on these word lists with us. This revealed evidence of misunderstandings and misinterpretations by those who recorded the language, further details on the meanings of the words recorded, and brought to light how some of these languages have changed or remained the same over time. By talking with community about these lists, it has given the library the opportunity to develop a deeper understanding of these collection materials and begin to explore ways that this knowledge can be shared beyond the scope of the exhibition, such as incorporating Indigenous knowledge into collection records. I will highlight some of these examples from our time speaking with Guugu Yimithirr peoples at Wyambur, Cooktown, Queensland. Guugu Yimithirr woman Arnie Alberta Hawkesby remarked to us on the word list that was recorded in 1770 from Joseph Banks that Susanna spoke about before, and the word bummer. And I'll play 2 of those recordings from Arnie Alberta for you now.
What is so interesting about this word list is that in the journals, they document that the English could not understand any of the words or hear the sounds of the language, but our people could imitate any of the sounds that were uttered by the British. So it's really interesting that the British were able to capture what was being said to them. This is the most exciting word to me because we in North Queensland call ourselves bummer, and he's got it here, bummer, and it means a man. But I suppose the most significant thing about the word bummer it actually means a man or a human being. So, you know, we know that was our people called themselves Bama before, and we still continue that today.
The Journal of Sydney Parkinson, who was the young artist on the Endeavour voyage, had in his journal what he described as men's names. Talking with Auntie Alberta about these, she revealed to us that these were in fact kinship terms. And I'll play you an excerpt from her about these now.
Other things in Parkinson's list that I was really excited about was the names of the men that he had in his word list. And we've been looking over these words for many years. And in discussions with others, about these names, one of the names he writes down as YAPPA and a separate word, GADUGOO. So we know from the way it is written that it's two words. Yappa means an older brother, the oldest brother. So we believe that when they were speaking, the speaker was say, and he was asked, "Who is that man?" He would have said, "Yappa ngatoko," which means that the person that was being pointed to was the speaker's oldest brother.
What I love about hearing the community talk about these word lists was that you can really see the languages come to life off the pages and imagine the conversations that would have been taking place 250 years ago. In the exhibition, you can hear more comments and language from other communities, including Tonga, the Moa Matchalat peoples of North America, Tahiti, and commentary about the significance of haka in Aotearoa. The legacy of Cook's 3 Pacific voyages has had and continues to have an impact on many First Nations peoples today. As an Indigenous woman myself, it was important for me to be able to work with communities to tell their story their way as part of this exhibition. I believe working with First Nations peoples on these word lists and cultural objects that we've been able to share their perspectives, and that has enriched this exhibition greatly in only a way that their contribution could have. It was one of our goals to connect visitors to this exhibition with the living, ongoing culture and languages of First Nations communities in Australia and across the Pacific. We wanted to ensure that these language lists were not just seen as a record from Cook's voyages, but give them the human face they deserve. These languages were spoken by ancestors and are still being used by communities today. It was an absolute privilege to work with community on these languages and stories, and I know the library and myself look forward to continuing our relationships with them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Holly, and thank you, Susanna, for an insight into Cook and the Pacific exhibition that is finishing up this weekend. So if you haven't had an opportunity to duck up and see it, I urge you to get up there and engage in it. It's a spectacular exhibition. Just hearing those presentations, I find it fascinating that some 250 years ago, that because of a shipwreck, that 2 nations are forced into a sort of contact. And what does that contact actually become? Spending 48 days not knowing that you might make it back to England, but how do you develop that relationship? I find it fascinating that you actually sit down and write a word list. And I always wonder if those people who wrote those journals some 250 years ago would have even imagined that today, 250 years later, that those same First Nations people, in this case the Guuga Yitama, are actually using their printed words and their text and reinvigorating and strengthening their culture and language. And I personally find that fascinating. And I think just going back to Kim Scott's presentation, the powerful analogy of language being a ripple effect, that it starts in the middle and goes out, but it's actually now coming back. And just hearing the stories there is such a great connection. Our next speaker is Paul Diamond. Paul was appointed the inaugural curator Maori at the Alexander Turnbull Library in 2011. He worked as an accountant for 7 years before switching to journalism in 1997, and his journalism has been recognised with the Qantas Media Award, Media Peace Prize, and he's also a fellowship to Oxford University in 2017. He's the author of 2 books, and he's also worked as an oral historian and broadcaster. And he's most recently at the National Library of Australia, enhancing the description of the library's Maori collection. Please welcome Paul Diamond.
Kia ora, e nā mana e nā reo kua whakaraui ka mai, tēnā koutou katoa. Anō te pai, te ahua reka o te noho tahi o nā teina me nā tuakana I runga I te whakaaro kotahi, tihei Moriora. Tuatahi, ka mihi ki a rātou mā kua wheturangi tia, nā reira nā mate, haere atu rā. Ki Hawaii ki nui, Hawaii ki roa, Hawaii ki pāmamao, ki te honu I wairua. Āpiti hono, tātai hono, rātou, te hunga mate ki a rātou, āpiti hono, tātai hono, tātou, te hungore ki a tātou katoa. Tuarua, ka mihi hoki ki nā tangata whenua o te rohi nei, te iwi nonoa, ka mihi ki nā kaumātua, nā kuia I mua, e nāia nei, hei nā tau ki te heke mai. Ka mihi hoki ki te whenua nei, arā, he whenua iwe takitaki I mua, e nāia nei, mo ake tono atu. Kia ora, and it's lovely to be here after having made my own little epic voyage from New Zealand. But thank you Sharon and the others here who made it possible for me to be here on time for this talk today. And as was mentioned, I was here 2 years ago, and it was incredibly exciting to be able to come back here. And when I gave my fellowship talk then, I spoke about how the production of Māori language was bound up in contact between Māori and missionaries. Today I'm revisiting that topic, focusing on Māori language collections at the Alexander Turnbull Library and how they help us trace the development of the language. And these collections are the result of engagement between Europeans, or Pākehā, and Māori in New Zealand, here in Australia, and also England. And I've chosen several case studies to illustrate this. The first missionaries were invited by Māori from Australia in 1814, but other Europeans had also been spending time in New Zealand before then. For example, John Savage, who came to Sydney in 1803 to work as assistant surgeon and then surgeon for Port Dalrymple. In June 1805, he was court-martialled for not having attended a settler's wife in childbirth, and he returned to England to clear his name. The voyage detoured to the Bay of Islands for ship repairs, and here Savage gathered the information for his book Some Account of New Zealand, published in London in 1807. As well as several illustrations, such as this one here at the beginning of the book includes a chapter on Māori language with a vocabulary list of 100 Māori words and numerals. It's that recurring theme about what to do when you've been shipwrecked or your ship needs repairs. So this is one of the there's 2 pages of word lists. Savage learned these words from Moehanga, a Māori man he took to England. The list has been compared to that compiled by Banks during James Cook's travels in New Zealand in 1769, which we've heard about. At this stage, the orthography of Māori wasn't settled and the language wasn't written in sustained sentences. This didn't happen until the missionaries came into contact with Māori, who travelled to Parramatta, which was the base for the CMS, Church Missionary Society missionaries. And there's another page there. It's quite cute that the list of colours. I could not find that they had any name for green, so no one told them about kakariki, which is also the name of a bird. But it's still a fascinating list, and done in that period before there really was agreement about how the language might be actually written. One missionary in particular played a very important role in, as he put it, attempting to fix the language of the New Zealanders so that they may be instructed in their own tongue. This was Thomas Kendall, on the right in this 1820 portrait by James Barry. Kendall was one of the founders of the Rangihauā mission in the Northern Bay of Islands. The driving force behind the establishment of the Church Missionary Society mission was Samuel Marsden, who first came to New Zealand in 1809. Marsden was a Yorkshireman who became chaplain to the prison colony of New South Wales in 1794. There he met and hosted many visiting Māori, especially northern chiefs, and felt they were more receptive to Christianity than the Aborigines of Australia. Thomas Kendall was a teacher and also a linguist who loved language. He'd read Savage's book while in England and built on its vocab list while travelling with Māori back to New Zealand. These included Tuai, the subject of a recent biography which describes him as Kendall's tutor. This is the second book by Alison Jones and Kuni Jenkins, and part of a shift in our historiography and scholarship, recognising Māori agency in our colonial past. Kendall and Tuai arrived in New Zealand in June 1814. By July the following year, Kendall had completed a first book for the instruction of the natives, and Marsden arranged for 200 copies to be printed in Sydney and sent to New Zealand. Tuai was, A Kōrau no New Zealand, or the New Zealander's first book. So this was the first printed attempt at full sentences and phrases in the Māori language. And it's actually the first New Zealand book. And these are two portraits of Tuai and his friend Titiri, which are in the Turnbull Library. Tuai was living at Samuel Marsden's school and farm in Parramatta from 1813, where he'd met Thomas Kendall. Marsden recruited Tuai as agent to help establish the mission in the Bay of Islands. After Tuai came back to Australia in 1817, Tuai, together with another Māori man from the Bay of Islands, Titiri, were sponsored by Marsden to travel to England, where they were hosted by CMS members. And I was really interested that these two were only in their 20s when they left, but Marsden, in the instructions that went back with the two to England, said, there's no point teaching these two how to read English. And I mean, they weren't that old, but and the missionaries in England ignored Marsden's advice and were instructing them in how to say the Lord's Prayer. But it really interests me that the profound implications of Marsden, particularly, but the missionaries more generally, deciding to work with Māori in their own language rather than teaching Māori English and then proselytising in English. While in England, Tuai and Titiri spent time with Samuel Lee, a linguistics scholar who became a professor of Oriental languages at Cambridge University, who was also involved with the CMS. The CMS asked Lee to build on Kendall's work with Tuai and help write a comprehensive grammar and vocabulary of the New Zealand tongue. This was eventually completed by Kendall and published in London in 1820, becoming one of New Zealand's first books and the second Māori language book after A Kōrau. Tuai and Titiri's contribution is acknowledged in a footnote to the preface of A Grammar and Vocabulary of the Language of New Zealand. And in his preface, Samuel Lee also outlines the two objects of the book. Firstly, to make the language useful to the New Zealanders. The other particular object is the instruction of the European missionary in the language of New Zealand, whereby he may be enabled to communicate the blessings of Christian instruction and civil improvement. And as I've said, this highlights the use of the Māori language by Māori, but also the decision of the missionaries to engage with Māori in their own language. And yeah, I think Tuai then would have been about 21. So I just thought it was amazing that Marsden thought no point trying to teach someone who's 21 how to read. And these productions, these publications help explain the origins of our Māori language collections in the Turnbull Library, which are arguably the biggest in the world, and we've been told it's the biggest collection of any Indigenous language in the world, because other countries there are multiple languages, or in Canada, things in English and French and other languages, rather than one single Indigenous language. So like modern language textbooks, the grammar and vocabulary gives insights into daily life at the time it was written. The book's 230 pages and contains a number of dialogues, capturing a sense of how Māori and Europeans encountered each other. For example, where is thy brother at Whangaroa? What is he doing there? He is seeking a wife. Who is the woman? Such an one, Teku. Is the parent agreeable? He is agreeable, the brother is displeased, and on it goes. When Duperrey and his French scientific expedition visited the Bay of Islands in 1824, they had copies of this grammar and vocabulary. The ship's chief lieutenant, James Jules Dumont d'Urville, quizzed Tuai about the untranslated material in the book, karakia, or prayers, and waiata, or songs, like this one, taught by Māori to pet tui birds, which Tuai tried unsuccessfully to teach the ship's cockatoo on the French voyage. Jumping now to 1825, and my final example, this is a letter by Edward Parry Hongi, a star student of one of the schools established by missionaries in the Bay of Islands. Hongi's letter to the Church Missionary Society, written when he was about 10, is regarded as the earliest known example of independent Māori writing. So there were letters written by Tuai and Titiri, for example, but they were dictated to missionaries, written by the missionaries on slates and then copied by the two men. But this letter is thought to be the first independent piece of writing. So the modern translation of this is, to the many chiefs of Europe, seeing my letter, give me some letter paper to enable me to write to you. You will appreciate my letter. I will be visiting your good village and will see if the houses are good houses. You may be displeased about my writing to ask of you whether or not the chief of your homeland is hostile. What is the name of the chief of the Pākehā there? Perhaps Māori are not adept at writing at this time. Who do the good people belong to out of the bad and the good ones? And what exactly is the appearance of the Pākehā then when I see them? 1 year I have been here. When will a payment be given to me and my good friend? Listen if you wish to know my name. Hongi is the name of the person who wrote this. And Alison Jones and Kuni Jenkins have described this letter as marking the end of the beginning of Māori engagement with writing. This letter represents a jumping off point when the technology of writing took off among Māori. And we have an exhibition at the library in Wellington called He Tohu, and one of the documents, the really significant documents along with the treaty, is He Whakaputanga, the Declaration of Independence, which was an agreement between Māori, some of the Māori leaders and the British Crown in 1835. And it was written, the Māori translation was written by this man, who unfortunately died the next year, and didn't, as far as I know, get to go to England, as he wanted to when he was a 10-year-old writing that letter. In both of their books, Jones and Jenkins discuss one phrase in the 1820 grammar, ka Māori tia te Pākehā. This was translated then as, are the Europeans naturalised? The word Māori means ordinary, so the historians argue it poses the question, will the Pākehā become Māori? Will they fit in? Will they adjust to ordinary New Zealand life and ideas, or will they remain different, standing apart? Nearly 200 years later, it's interesting to reflect on this question as efforts to revive Te Reo Māori, the Māori language, continue. Speaking after the most successful Māori Language Week ever, the head of the Māori Language Commission, Ngahiwi Apanui, acknowledged that the audience for the Commission's efforts is Aotearoa Whānui, the whole of New Zealand, and not limited to Māori. This sense of combined effort is reminiscent of the past, when the Māori language was first written down. As well as recognising Māori agency and autonomy, inherent in this story is a generosity of spirit, Māori welcoming Europeans to join them and work together. The spirit of those early encounters, as recorded in collections in New Zealand, here and elsewhere, lives on. And inspired by this history, the National Library of New Zealand is reviewing the bibliography of printed Māori up to 1900, books in Māori or Ngā Tāngā Reo Māori, to check what has been digitised in New Zealand and other countries. We're working with researchers and repositories to determine what and how to digitise material not yet digitised. And it's great that that's actually underway in terms of the collections that are held here. Our vision and aim is that the corpus of printed Māori becomes available as a resource for language revitalisation as well as research. Kia ora.
Thank you, Paul. I love that early letter from Hongi to England. It reminds me of the Bennelong letter of 1796, I think, which the copy is held here in the library. Some beautiful phrases in the early part of this country's history. So thank you for that. Our next speaker is Ray Ingrie. Ray's a Dharawal man from La Perouse Aboriginal community in Botany Bay. And every time I fly to Sydney and fly over Botany Bay, I always try to look out for his house because he's one of the iconic figures of the La Perouse community. He's been a membership, he's had a number of leadership roles within the community, and he is the General Manager and Public Officer of the Eastern Zone Gugaja Aboriginal Corporation, and he's also chairperson of the Dharawal Language Program. And the program is the leading language reclamation in La Perouse Aboriginal community, and they're doing some fantastic work with the younger generation in revitalising Dharawal language. So please welcome Ray Ingri.
Nyagabi Yilanjang Nagang Rangray Gamango Ba Dharawal Ngai Gurwara Ngalamangai Gamring Ngai Dharawalanga Ngalamajang Gambri Guli Ba Nganawuli Murnum. Hello, how are you all? My name is Ray Ingray. I belong to Botany Bay and I am Dharawal. I live at La Perouse and I'm speaking Dharawal. We are gathered on the lands of the Ngambri and Ngunnawal people. So I'm here to talk about RH Mathews' papers. I'm going to do that and how we utilise those, but there's probably a bit of a quick background story, or it's a story that goes for well over 150 years. So growing up, I was always told by my elders that your language and your land go together. Your language is what connects you to your family, your ancestors, your environment, including land, sea and sky. Knowing your land and knowing your language will keep your spirit strong, keeping your country strong, giving you a strong and healthy identity. That's what triggered my interest in language. Our people, despite what people think, families of the La Perouse Aboriginal community have traditional and cultural connections from coastal Sydney all the way to the Illawarra and Shoalhaven. Despite what our people have gone through, including past government policies and intervention, where disruption of Aboriginal culture, connection to our language and land was devastating, we still retain a lot of cultural knowledge. Language is still present in the memories of families within our community, and our language, our elders record their parents and older siblings speaking fluently. So in early 2001, I started asking some elders about how we go about starting a language program. I knew it was something our community had wanted to do since the early 80s. And after speaking to the Dharawal Elders group at the time, I was given some papers. One old girl said, "Read these and come back." RH Mathews is his name, Mirinan they called him. There was trust in her voice. Mathews was an amateur anthropologist who sat with many Aboriginal people in many places. He had a different approach to other anthropologists and linguists of his day, and would have access to Aboriginal people, senior Aboriginal people, in many Aboriginal camps. Started to look at his published work. I started saying, I know that word, I know that word, hey, I know we say that right now. And so we went back, got some old tapes. I'm not talking about CDs, they were tapes back then, you had to wind them up. So they got caught in a tape player. An old white lady voice come on, well-to-do, and it said, "This is Janet Mathews talking to Mr. Howard Timbry of Wreck Bay." Old Uncle Jock started talking. I know what he's saying. One old girl said to me, "He was a deadly fella, Jock." She had trust in her voice. Another said, "See those papers of Mathews? That woman there is my grandmother, and I remember her when I was a little girl." Again, trust in her voice. Mathews and Mary Everett sat down with our senior people of Botany Bay, including Biddy Giles, a Dharawal woman whose father was a small boy when Cook entered Botany Bay, Mrs. Timbry, Mrs. Judson, Mrs. Saunders, Mrs. Anderson, Mrs. Clara Phillip, and Mrs. Malone. They were all old people. They weren't just names on paper for our elders. They weren't just words to them. It was a part of who they were because they were their ancestors. They're our ancestors. So our program started to get some interest from other young people, and we started to go through and pull out the Dharawal language in RH Mathews' published work. We got to a stage where we needed some linguistic assistance, and along come Yura Bessold, a PhD student at Australian National University. Yura came up to La Perouse this one time and she opened up a big suitcase with copies of RH Mathews' notebooks. There were language words and sentences and names and locations and cultural information. For us, she just opened up a treasure chest. The language program members volunteer their time to progress the program and is supported by Eastern Zone Gujaga Aboriginal Corporation. Only now are we getting the attention we need to meet our community's demand. I must say we don't use RH Mathews papers in isolation, and I'll talk a bit about that later on. But we use these papers for a number of reasons. Like I said, our elders had trust. Our old people established relationships with influential families like the Hill and Wentworth families in Sydney, who provided direction and introduction to people like RH Mathews. It was well known that members of the Hill family spoke fluent language from coastal Sydney. I want to highlight relationships and trust as key to why we use RH Mathews papers. If this relationship was unknown to us or to our elders, we wouldn't be using them. It was the trust in our elders to say, use these papers. If we fast forward 70 odd years, and RH Mathews' granddaughter-in-law, who I mentioned, Mrs. Janet Mathews, she took part in our ATSIS program, Document Languages by Recording Our Old People. Martin Thomas, an academic at Australian National University, provides further insight into Janet Mathews and adds another connection she has to the Aboriginal people of coastal Sydney. It says, from the 60s through the 70s, Janet Mathews worked with the Dharawal and Durga people of the New South Wales South Coast and in other parts of the state, recording songs, language and stories. Her instrument was a tape recorder. Her employer, the newly formed Australian Institute for Aboriginal Studies, to which Torres Strait Islanders were later added. A well-to-do woman of upper middle class background, she had no qualification as an ethnographer, though she was an accomplished pianist, a music teacher and a friend of the parliamentary W.C. Wentworth, who advanced her name when, against the odds, he managed to convince the Menzies government that the formation of an institute that would collect and store the remaining fragments of Aboriginal culture was not only a fitting way to spend taxpayers' money, but also a duty to the nation and indeed the world. As our old people call him, not W.C. Wentworth, Billy Wentworth, they call him, and there was an Aboriginal Billy Wentworth who was his relative, so we won't get the two confused. But Billy Wentworth was the Aboriginal Affairs Minister in the federal government and worked closely with the grandson of Dharawal language informant Ellen Anderson. Uncle Tom Williams, OBE, was a great-grandson of Paddy Burragalong, who worked with Billy Wentworth's great-grandfather, old W.C. Wentworth, as a cob and co-driver between his Vaucluse and Illawarra estates in the mid-1800s. Connection, relationship, trust. Mrs. Mathews, in my opinion, gathered the most valuable information. She had access to knowledgeable informants. But it wasn't until it contributed to the relationship that she had, that her grandfather-in-law had. She recollects, I do remember one little story in particular that Uncle Bill said, how he was taken so often to La Perouse with his father, and his father would tell him to go and play on the beach or amuse themselves, and he'd disappear into one of the little humpies and the children would play around, sometimes for so long that they'd get rather tired of it. And Uncle Bill at one stage thought, oh, he wished the old man would hurry up and go home. So he popped along and looked inside and saw old Mrs. Timbry, who was one of his best durable informants, sitting on a box. And your grandfather was sitting on a box with his notebook and his pencil, writing very hard. They were both smoking pipes and Uncle Bill was waved away and they just had to go and wait. I think I'd like to add a little bit of the impression that I've had from the Aborigines that remember him, which was rather a surprise to me because when I first started doing field work on the south coast, I just felt that he was grandfather-in-law and had written books, and it really was magnificent what he'd done, but he didn't seem to be a real person to me until I was very new at the game. I was at Wreck Bay at the reserve. It was my first visit there. I knocked on the door of Mr. Howard Timbry and his wife. I'd said that my name was Mathews and I was just at the gate and going to leave when he said, "Would you be any relation to the old man who used to come to La Perouse?" Which amazed me, and I said yes, he was my grandfather-in-law. And to an extent, from that time on, work on the south coast became very much easy for me because there had been a lot of antagonism for various reasons. Relationships, trust. Uncle Jock was obviously the grandson of RH Mathews' language informant, Mrs. Timbry. His language information was consistent with what was documented by RH Mathews 70 years beforehand. Other old people, informants were recorded: Mrs. Anderson, who's the daughter of Ellen Anderson, Mrs. Mary Idler, who's the granddaughter of Kate Saunders, Mrs. Lena Chapman, who's a relation to Mrs. Judson. All these people in the 1960s being recorded and their relations were being documented in the late 1800s. Up until the 1990s, our community had relationships with the Mathews family. My grandmother and great auntie, with other elders, would go and visit Mrs. Mathews. Only recently, a Durrell senior knowledge holder, Uncle Shane Williams, shared a conversation he had with Janet Mathews around 1990. She explained to him that the family was clearing out an old basement and was about to throw out some old notebooks when she intervened and said, "These may be of some importance." Uncle Shane is a descendant of a number of RH Mathews language informants. The Durrell Language Program, and directly to Mathews' paper, undertakes a confirmation process. RH Mathews' papers are critical to us. We look at what the archival documents say, which includes early colonial papers, previous amateur linguists and anthropologists like the Reverend Andrew Mackenzie, and what our community have said in the past through IATSIS tapes and other personal tapes and belongings from our community, and what we say today. And we do that because even though the archival stuff, particularly in the colonial days, gives us some raw information of Sydney, it was culturally not, I don't want to offend anyone, the interpretation wasn't through a cultural lens. And so the interpretation of those, and we've got many examples, and I might touch on that later on. So here's an example of that outcome. So here's an example of RH Mathews' notebook. So sometimes now we're going through the notebook. So the National Library late last year gave us approval for two people of our research and language team to come down and copy Mathews' papers, which was great. But here's an example of the notebook. You might be able to see, I'm not too sure, but it was never they never publish it, but you'll see the name Mrs. Saunders up on the side. Mrs. Saunders is my grandmother's grandmother. Her father was from coastal Sydney. Her mother was from the Illawarra. So what was documented over 120 years ago is still what we say today. So on your right, there's an example of language that we use when we teach at home. So Yara Mangai, I am throwing. Yara Mabi, you are throwing. Yara Ma, he is throwing. Yara Ma Bul, you two are throwing. As mentioned previously, we have people in our community that remember their parents and grandparents and older siblings speaking fluently. Uncle Leslie Davison has shared some moments, and he's an elder at Lapa, of the moments his mother, a fluent language Dharawal speaker and granddaughter of the language informant Mrs. Saunders, was threatened by the police for teaching him and his older brother. So one day they got a knock on the door. It was a policeman, it was a neighbour. They lived off the reserve. It was a neighbour heard them being taught language and rang the police, and the police said, "We'll lock both of you up, both parents up, if you continue to teach." Our last fluent speakers passed away in the early 2000s. They were quite senior women living in isolation. They were known language fluent speakers when they were younger, and both of their grandmothers were language informants of RH Mathews. RH Mathews gives us cultural, ceremonial and belonging information. In his notebooks, he documents the makeup of the Laparoos Aboriginal community in the early 1900s. Done a bit of transcribing for you. So, the interesting part about these is that it takes a lot of time to get through, but it's interesting. It's valuable for our community. So that just explains that, you know, Aboriginal people have been living for around about 20 years at a camp near the village of Laparoos, which is consistent with the establishment of the Aborigines Protection Board and the moving of our people from camps around Sydney Harbour to be out of sight, out of mind of the colony. And it states clearly that they comprise of all the remains of the descendants of the native tribe that occupied the district at the time of the English occupation of New South Wales in 1788. The Dharawal Language Program's objective is to ensure the Dharawal language is revoiced and repracticed within our community, using the language material documented by people like RH Mathews. We're able to develop resources. We run a semi-immersion program in our community-controlled early education settings and deliver adult classes through Cert 1, Cert 2 and Cert 3, Dharawal language courses. So if I was a child at Gujaga, and Gujaga just means child, but that's what we call our childcare centre and our preschool, I'll be exposed to language and culture each day. I'll be asked by the aunties and uncles, what are you Yindagangali Walla? Where's your head? Monday Yindagangali Dunbar, go get your hat. Wajit you Yendra, go to the tree. I'll be singing children's songs in Dharawal such as Head, Shoulders, Knees and Toes, Rain, Rain, Go Away, Crab and Seashell, Incy Wincy Spider, list goes on. I'd be hearing about our dreaming stories and some recent ones as well. I would then say Nandawabi to the aunties and uncles when I get picked up by a mum or dad or auntie or uncle. We've developed the resources you see on the screen to support all these teachings. Our feedback from the adults who have participated in our language courses are things like it affirms our cultural identity. They participate because they want to respect the wishes of our elders, even though the majority of them are all deceased now. The lessons were relevant, informative. The ability to go on country and learn language there is important, and being able to learn it with their family members so it can be reinforced at home. So we developed all these resources. I want to share with you one quickly right now. Got time, JP? Yeah. The resource that you'll see, it's developed from 3 short story books. Our old people were concerned that there was 2 traditional practices that were dying out in our community, being spearfishing and shell work. So they spoke to some elders around what a typical day was, either spearfishing and collecting shells, and we translated that into language. The third one, the elders wanted to reach into kids' imagination using a very old delicacy, honey. So I just want to share with you the near final draft of this resource, Jilanunglanga. Nawai, Gundu Wulawaliyu, Yenda Yangai, Jilanulanga, Wagari. Ngagambi, Ngaigang Banda. Nganung Yindigang.
Nagambi Banda, Nayagang Buru, Mingalanga Wayagabi,
Jilanung, Wagangai.
Yan Babi Nandari Guriwal Mujidan, Jilanung Murnunda,
Mingang Nai.
Gugura Jajinai, Gundada Nguranung,
Nganung Nai.
Gunung Wir, Bira Danma. Ngajung Mandoangul, Nyunduri.
Nagambi Buri. Nganung Nai.
Nagambi Bilama, Bandanai,
What do you Yinbu?
Guriwa Ngurunungu, Yandangalin.
Nanduwanying Bilama.
Nga, Nagunai. Na yanda binbi. Nagona babaga nying, biwid bambawabi.
Yakai. Gurwul Nai. Gunduda.
Nagambi Gurwal. Nai Mujijan Banda. Jilanu Langa Wayaga. Nagambi Buru. Nagambi Banda. Nandra Garanung Wulwala. Jilanung Nai.
Ngala Yangil. Dunmurray. Thank you.
What a great animation, isn't it? It's so great to hear Indigenous language and see it being transmitted on to the next generation. We're going to break for lunch in about 5 to 10 minutes, but I'm going to invite our speakers up to sit on the chairs up here. We might just have a couple of minutes of Q&A to close off their session. So if you want to come up and sit up here. We might grab one of the mics for the speakers. Has anyone got any questions they would like to ask any of the speakers? While people are thinking of a question, Susanna and Holly, I might ask you a question. Most Australians would not even know of the language that is contained in Cook's Journal and also a lot of the journals here at the National Library. How do we try and engage the younger generation and next generations into learning and appreciating those word lists?
Well, I think that's a really good question. And I think it's something that where the National Library is definitely committed to making access happen. We really want to engage, we want to make our records available and have those conversations. And it's been it's been a wonderful part of our exhibition in that we've been able to do that, not only with our own collections, but also with the collections of the lenders that we borrow from. So yes, it's...
Holly, you don't have to say anything. We take that as a comment.
I suppose I'd just make a comment that as part of the exhibition we are, where we can, making digital repatriation to communities to be able to have these records available to use for their community and their future generations.
Is that important? Is it important to, as Ray said, to have the trust that we've got something of yours and we're going to give something back as maintaining that relationship? Is that important?
Yeah, absolutely. Language is their intellectual property, so those stories belong to them.
Yeah. And Paul, just before we go to a question from the audience, are the younger generation in New Zealand engaging in their institutions and the collections similar to what we have in Australia?
Yes, although I think there's a big opportunity there, and and to be honest, it's a little bit hard at the moment to make the connection between the archival material and the language revitalisation movement, because I think the emphasis has been up till now on elders and first language people, but as there are fewer of them, I think there's a big opportunity. And initially we're working with language researchers, language geeks who, linguists and others. And for example, there's someone in New Zealand who developed the Māori Google platform, and he's involved with this natural language project, which relies on, for each language, it relies on having a corpus of words. And English has got a ginormous corpus. Māori's got a tiny wee corpus. And so he's supportive of what we're trying to do, because all of that language that we're thinking of digitising, if we make it text searchable, becomes an amazing resource for that. And so it's this whole area of digital humanities. So if we can link that up as well. But yeah, the hope would be that more young people do get engaged. And I think some of Kim's examples were inspiring too. Even just small collections and just taking them, engaging with communities and learning from them, really.
Yeah. And Ray, your community have undertaken a recent project in partnership with Microsoft and the New South Wales Government to engage digital technologies with the younger generation. Do you want to tell us about that?
Yeah, so the New South Wales Department of Education, Microsoft and our language program partnered up and with Indigenous storytelling to create augmented reality. The Nyurgang project, where we told an old dreaming story through augmented reality, and then a number of the kids developed their own cards and animations for a number of kinship verbs and objects. And it was a bit hesitant from our elders, because technology, they don't embrace the technology. But after that day, they're like, when are we doing more of this? We don't have the resources to engage that, so we look to corporates and government to help us to keep up to speed with the technology and the kids' use of it. And we, in La Perouse, our program, seeing it as a way we need to move forward, because our kids are just too technological advanced for us.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Any questions? The question over here.
Yes, I have the mic. This is a question about the role of archival language sources in dispelling the myth. Dispelling the myth that Indigenous languages change rather chaotically or randomly or rapidly because they're not written. As many in this room will know, the Cooks and Banks lists have been shown to be very close to the current language for the Cooktown area. I'm just wondering, and indeed even the name Yapariku, which was a man's name, was still in use in the 1890s. I'm just wondering if, in the case of New Zealand or other parts of the Pacific, whether these old records have actually come up with a similar answer to the question of how stable were these languages.
Yeah, well, before I came here, I was at an Indigenous Librarians Forum in Auckland, and someone from the north told me about when an exhibition of copies of digitised material from the missionary archives, there are copies and journals from Marsden and others in Dunedin, and they took a sort of a travelling version of that to the north. And apparently there are still some of the examples of the dialect. So they wrote H as SH, and that apparently was because the people in the north which is one of the areas I affiliate to, spoke quite gutturally with a shongi, instead of hongi. And this archivist was just amazed that that still sort of exists. And as those historians I mentioned have pointed out, the Māori who were teaching the missionaries at that stage said to the missionaries they couldn't actually understand people from other parts of the North Island. So I know I was saying we have one language, but the dialect differences were quite strong. But no, I think you're right, that it does show these things have quite an enduring presence.
Thank you. Question up here.
Thank you all for your presentations today. They've been fantastic. I'm interested in the way language forms the way we think, and the way we think informs our language, and the differences between New Zealand and Maori and missionaries wanting to teach in Maori, whereas in Australia it was English and banning Indigenous language, and what that means for reconciliation, and maybe bringing to the fore more Indigenous language, helping in that reconciliation process and our understanding of empowering the Indigenous culture better.
Ray, do you want to take that first response?
It was interesting, like, because I know that with the missionaries, there's some things that helped us in Aboriginal communities, I suppose. I know there was swift, and government policies were quite swift. But up until in La Perouse, up until only the 1910s, the 1920s, our people spoke it. You had people like Richard Hill and those that would speak it fluently, that were government officials, and would speak in language to them, and it was documented as such. But it wasn't until government policy and it became the Aboriginal Protection Board became bureaucratic that it really, it was devastating for us. For us, yes, the missionaries told them not to speak language and stuff, but in some cases, my great-grandmother was born on Larbour Beach in 1884. The missionaries took her to a small community called Bellbrook. She learnt Dungari quite quickly up there, and actually translated the Bible into Dungari so that her oldest kids could actually read the Bible. So it did, there's a twos and fro's for it. Compared to New Zealand, I can't recall the gentleman's name, Martin, he's a senior official, public servant over in, they started a language nest. They come and looked at what we do, and they want to come and bring some people from New Zealand over to look at how we're doing our community-based language reclamation, and the missionary movement and they want us to go over there and have a look at the language nest over there, and that's something that we would be keen to compare how different the missionaries were in New Zealand, now I'm hearing, compared to here. Yeah. I don't know if that answered your question, but I hope so.
Just a further point on that, Ray, in terms of language being used as to achieve reconciliation or to work towards reconciliation, do you hope that the majority of Australians who would fly to Sydney and land in Botany Bay could identify Dharawal words or Dharawal places? And do you see that as a way of achieving sort of a greater partnership for this nation between black and white?
Yeah, our position, like many Aboriginal communities around New South Wales, and I can't speak for all of Australia, nor am I saying I can speak for New South Wales, but I've got experience working around the state in this space. Aboriginal communities want to teach all kids language. For our own kids, it's about them understanding, it's that spiritual connection, that belonging, understanding who they are. For non-Aboriginal kids, it's about getting a unique insight into the world's oldest living culture. And so I would imagine that not only kids, but adults as well, and that really only enhances that true reconciliation process. As for places like Sydney Airport, we're always advocating for that, to lift the visitor experience like you have in New Zealand and elsewhere, and even in regional towns now where you're getting at least reading a welcome to country, or you know, there's some local language where we're encouraging that, and there's conversations with Sydney Corporation around that as well, which is good because our elders are now ready to share it. We're not as private as we used to be as a community.
Yeah, and it's going back to your presentation about the trust. There's got to be a level of trust.
I used to sit with the elders who I mentioned, that new language. They would get a non-Aboriginal academic would come to them, you know, at an event or somewhere and say, do you know language? And they'll say, oh, no, you'll have to go and see so-and-so, and I was like, hey, we were just doing a workshop yesterday at home. Like, what do you mean? And it was that trust in, well, I'm not, and you know, and it got to a stage where actually an academic in the language space in Sydney used to phone up and harass one of our elders to give them information. And yeah, so it's built on that trust, and I think now our elders, our community is seeing the rapid loss of language, so those elders are passing away. A vast knowledge is going with them, and they see that, no, we need to capture this and make sure. So if someone leaves us tomorrow, goes to the next world, then we're not scrambling like we have been in the past.
Okay. Any other questions? All right, I just might do a final question to Susanna and Holly. You spoke in your presentation about consultation with communities, and in particular, you know, those up the East Coast. What do you think it means to communities like the Guugi-Yithima to see their words and their language and their culture displayed, and quite a prominent part of this exhibition in one of Australia's iconic national institutions? In your consultations with them, what were they saying about their words being included?
I mean, just from me briefly, before I'll hand to Holly. No, I mean, I think they were really thrilled to see their language in our show on the screens, the touch screens that we have in the show. It was an incredible privilege to just have that conversation where, I mean, they knew so much more, obviously, about these words than we could possibly ever know, and they were sharing their opinions, such rich knowledge, and yeah, so I think that they were really happy. I know that we took them through, and they were thrilled.
Yeah, it was, as we said, it was such a privilege to work with them and have them share their stories and perspective and language. And Auntie Alberta Hornsby always spoke about how she was just thrilled that finally their stories and their perspectives are included in the narrative and are getting out there for everyone in Australia to hear.
All right, thank you very much, Holly. Look, we might conclude it there because we're cutting into now lunchtime, but could you please put your hands together for our panellists, Ray, Susanna, Paul and Holly. Thank you very much.